Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to wait a couple more minutes just to see if anyone else joins. We appreciate your patience. Okay, everyone, we've got 3 after. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for attending the Planning for Connectivity in a Post-COVID-19 World session of the APA New York Upstate Chapter 2020 Virtual Conference. My name is Jesse Vogel, and my colleague Sandy Miswitz and I will be your hosts for this session. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our session sponsor, WSP. Without our partners, this virtual conference would not be possible. We'd also like to let everyone know that all sessions are being recorded and attendees will receive an email link to the recordings once they've been posted to the conference website. Also, all attendees are automatically muted. If you have any questions, and we do encourage questions, please submit them in the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end of the session. We're happy to say that the session is eligible for 1.5 CM credits. The CM number is 920-5109. And that number will also be posted in the chat box. But again, that's 920-5109. Today's session is being presented by Yanel Kusiker, a network real estate regulatory project manager for upstate New York with Verizon Wireless. He's responsible for informing local municipalities and stakeholders on Verizon's small cell deployment strategy and building critical partnerships to streamline 5G deployment. He holds a master's in public policy from the University of Michigan. With Yanel is Elizabeth Glidden, former municipal planner in Maryland and Connecticut, and currently a regulatory specialist with Verizon Wireless. Liz has 25 years of municipal planning experience and holds a master's from the University of Maryland. We also have with us Joseph Post, Verizon Deputy General Counsel, State Regulatory Affairs for New York State. I'll now turn the presentation over to Yanel.
All right, thank you, Jesse. And let me start sharing. All right. I think this is working right. I'm going to get a confirmation that you have the screen. Thank you for the introduction, Jesse. Sandy, good morning, everyone. My name is Yanel. I'm part of Verizon Network's real estate regulatory team supporting upstate New York. I'm based in Rochester, but my colleagues, Joe and Liz, will be joining from New Jersey and Connecticut. So we're really talking about connectivity, and we're displaying the connectivity here as well. First of all, on behalf of all our team members, I want to thank the American Planning Association New York Upstate Chapter for organizing this virtual conference and providing us the opportunity to present on a timely and critical subject, which is connectivity. We would have preferred to deliver this presentation in person from Albany and even bring our 5G bus for our hands-on experience. That's something actually we did last year for a different event, but unfortunately the conditions does not allow us to do that. Hopefully next year things will change and we'll be able to start doing these things again. The ongoing pandemic made all of us to realize the importance and demand for connectivity. As a result, we started getting more questions regarding small cells and 5G. What is it? When is it coming? Is it really that fast? Do I have 5G service here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all kinds of questions. Although we won't be able to answer user-specific 5G questions in today's presentation, our goal is to provide resources and guidance to become familiar with this next generation technology, along with the new rules and regulations that govern their deployment. After all, it wouldn't be misleading to claim that increasing demand for connectivity means nearly every municipality and municipal entity will be dealing with building requests, local law and ordinance amendments, in compliance with local, state, and federal laws. As a result, over the next 80 minutes or so, my colleagues and I will try to provide an overview of small cells. I know it's a lot, but bear with us. Laws, regulations, and orders that affect the placement of 5G facilities in public right-of-ways in New York, and our planning takeaways based on our collective experiences, that is both in New York and Connecticut. And we hope that our experience, particularly in Syracuse, will be helpful for other municipalities in upstate that are considering partnering with a wireless provider or have already considered and looking for additional guidance. All right, let's get started here. Let's talk about demand first. There are numerous studies from reputable sources that capture and explain our increasing demand for wireless networks. Here, I was attempting to use the ones that makes the most amount of sense, but I think at this point, you don't really need any statistics. And I'll tell you why. I'm gonna use myself as an example. I have two phones, one for work, one for personal, two laptops, again, one for personal, one for work. My wife has a personal phone and an iPad. We have an almost 2-year-old. Luckily, he doesn't have any phones or devices, but he sure likes to use them. And so we have a total of 6 wireless devices in a small, with 2 adults in the household, basically. By the way, I'm not even including the TV, the smart TV, the thermostat, so on and so forth. So it just gives you an idea as to how many devices an average adult has. I think at this point, it's common knowledge that more and more people every day rely on their wireless devices as a means to manage their personal, business, school, and even family lives, especially now that COVID is around. We're doing a lot more, spending a lot more time in front of our devices and doing a lot more with them, right? So the bottom line is that more devices mean we're becoming more dependent on wireless connectivity, and we are using increasingly more data because we are simply doing and demanding a lot more from our connectivity. Next, I'm going to share you some stats here from our, let me put this down here, I don't know if I'm blocking here. So here, I would like to share something about COVID-19 related developments, since we're talking about COVID times. Take a look at these numbers we captured during the first 90+ days of the lockdown. Whether it is gaming, browsing, social media, or simple phone calls, we all contributed to these statistics and continue to do so, right? I mean, I can definitely see myself I don't do gaming, but at some point, social media, web browsing, so on and so forth, especially now video streaming, that's pretty big, and that's what we're doing today. So there's no doubt that the pandemic increased the demand and accelerated this move to a digital working and entertainment environment. Let me give you an example from Verizon. We were talking about this earlier before the conference started, actually. Back in March, Verizon sent 90% of its workforce home, and we continue to work from home since then. and it doesn't look like we're going to be going back anytime soon. That rates are going up if you're following all the developments. The use of collaboration tools such as video conferencing, like the one that we're using, which we all now use at least once a day, right? We're using it. I use it more than once a day. Is directly related to capacity needs of the network. So think about moments and places where your phone did not have any signal or the connection was spotty. There's a good chance you or your family were frustrated and questioned the amount of money you were paying for the service you weren't getting, right? You're probably cursing and saying things about the carrier. But I had to take a note here. As planners and professionals working in this field, you're probably more likely to know the underlying reasons for the coverage and capacity issue than an average person. So now imagine if you needed to make an emergency 911 call, not having a reliable service could have serious consequences, right? According to New York State Senator George Borrello, similar to water, sewer, electric, and roads, connectivity in broadband is no longer a luxury. It is, and I quote for him, is a basic infrastructure need. If I were to borrow an economic terminology, so we talked about demand and all these things. So increasing demand for connectivity requires telecom companies to supply the network that can meet and exceed the capacity and reliability needs in the future. As Verizon, we invest significant time and resources to monitor network performance and accurately forecast the demand nationwide. However, as you would expect, constantly building and upgrading the network and the telecom infrastructure is a complex, lengthy, and costly process. So I try to cover the reasons why telecom companies need to upgrade and build. In the next segment, I'm going to take a look at the next generation technology, small cells. So that's the most fun part, actually. All right. Small cell, here you're seeing an example of a small cell. It's just like the name implies, it's literally a mini cell site with a radio antenna, power, and a fiber connection that augments the network in any given area. In the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that we brought the 5G bus to Albany last year in October for a different event, right? So this is the photo from that event, and what you're seeing here is the older generation small cell. So the newer generations are actually already shorter and slimmer than this. I know you can't see the depth of it, but they're getting more and more compact. Just like your cell phones, the antennas are getting smaller and smaller as well. The smaller cells provide added 5G and 4G wireless capacity and coverage. In other words, they can be 4G or 5G. If you're wondering whether it is possible to determine the type of antenna, particularly on a utility pole, the answer is yes, and I'm going to show you how to do that with some of the imagery that we have from some of the sites across upstate. The coverage area for a small cell can range from a few hundred feet to upwards of 1,000 feet. This is one of the questions that we get all the time. How many do you need and why do you need that many? That depends on the topography, the capacity needs, and various other factors. These lower power antennas are designed to enhance the capacity in high traffic areas, dense urban areas, suburban neighborhoods, and more. So it's a different usage that we're looking at here for this type of technology. This diagram is providing a sort of a good understanding of how macros and existing small cells and macros basically blend in what we call the wireless ecosystem and network densification. And it's one of the frequently asked questions that we get is regarding the number of small cells. How many are you going to build and why that many? Why not here? Why not this number? It is important to keep in mind that a wireless network is basically a mesh of technologies that includes macros to small cells, various other antenna systems you may not even be aware of that's in building and so on and so forth. So that's the network densification, as I said before. They all work in concert with each other, but small cells are needed to provide more wireless capacity to complement macro facilities. So in order to successfully deliver its capabilities, today's small cells technology require them to be closer to the end user for optimal experience, especially in the case of 5G. Facilities must be really close to the end user to enjoy the optimal experience. So if I were to use an analogy, for example, if you're looking at a reading light, if the reading light is too far away from you, it doesn't work. Same thing, kind of like a Wi-Fi router too. If you are close to the Wi-Fi router, have access to a direct line of sight and so on and so forth, you get better signal, therefore you get better experience. So the 5G antennas work in a somewhat of a similar way. Small cells won't make macro sites obsolete. That's one other question that people keep asking. Are you going to get rid of the macros? No, we won't. That's because it would require at least 10 to 15 small cell sites to fill these spaces in an urban suburban macro sites, and they're still useful. As you can see from the image, they serve different purposes. If you don't yet have a 5G phone or not planning on getting one for the upcoming holidays, you don't need to be alarmed. In order to have take advantage of the 5G network, you have to have a 5G phone. That's one fact. But the existing 4G LTE that we're all using at this point, unless you have a 5G phone, is not going to go away anytime soon. In fact, it will be around for many years to come. Remember, I mentioned that building a network takes time, energy, and effort, and it's a lengthy process. So that existing system will be in place for a while. Speaking of 4G in many years, let's take a look at how our networks and phones have evolved in a relatively short period of time. So this is another fun slide that I'd like to talk about because it reminds me old times. Approximately every 10 years or so, as you can see from here, from 1980s to 2020 from now, approximately every 10 years or so, we're upgrading into a new generation of wireless communication technology. I'm not going to date myself, but I'm old enough to be able to remember all of these generations here. And so I'm going to quickly refresh everyone's memory. So starting with 5G, that was simple. It provided only voice capability. 2G is the one that gave us the text messaging. Remember how happy we were text messaging each other back and forth. And it was the big thing to do. Then 3G came in. That was a revolutionary thing. It gave us some smartphones. An iPhone was the first iPhone. iPhone was the first pioneer, the first smartphone that came out, and everything changed from that point on. We started accessing internet, doing things over the internet. And finally, 4G gave us the video streaming, which we do a lot these days, apps, and many other connected services and devices that we rely and enjoy today, right? Here's an interesting thing. Now we're talking about a pandemic, but consider this. If we were to have a pandemic during the 3G era in the 2000s here, we simply wouldn't be able to do any of the capabilities we enjoy from our networks and devices today, including having virtual conferences. So we wouldn't be able to have a virtual conference if we were in the 2000s, right? And that would be a really, really challenging and boring times for us. And we wouldn't be able to, work productivity would be probably close to zero. Now with 5G, we're witnessing a transformation. So this is totally different than the previous generations. It's a total transformation, a high bandwidth coupled with low latency. By the way, the millimeter wave are another frequency that is being repurposed to provide improved wireless experience. I'm not getting into too much detail here with millimeter wave because I don't want to confuse you too much with the technical detailed information. But it has the ability to support massive amounts of device on a network, what's known as the Internet of Things, the IoT. It's the digital network of all these new connected devices, machines, platforms, and sensors. So it's not just about the phone itself, it's just a network and what it can do, what it can provide, all the capabilities. You're seeing something here, as you can see, we were starting with the baby steps, started running, and we're going really fast with 5G. And with the 5G lab, I would like to mention something interesting here with 5G lab. I thought it would be helpful for the audience. I already mentioned how unique this 5G network is, this new generation technology. This transformation makes it very unique because as a result of its capabilities and characteristics, Verizon has a special division called the 5G Lab. Their job is to find people and organizations with ideas and provide them with the resources to explore and create the best products and services and applications that would bring the true power of the 5G to life, basically. For example, there's a 5G first responder lab where they focus on innovative ideas and technologies that can save lives. Again, I wish we had the opportunity to show you the 5G bus so you can see some of these things and experience and touch and feel it in person. The reason why I'm mentioning this is not to promote Verizon. I'm sure other carriers have similar divisions and initiatives, but to emphasize the true potential this next generation network, the 5G ecosystem has in terms of research and development and changing how we live, learn, work, and play, right? All right, more questions that we've been getting. And the other one is how we determine small cell locations. Well, regardless of where we propose to build it, there's always an NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. It's always a reality, and we recognize that because we put ourselves in their position. We live and work in the same neighborhoods. So our RF engineers analyze the areas that need improvement to figure out the ideal location based on customer needs, terrain, and modeling results, which I mentioned briefly earlier. Then we pick a location that has the highest likelihood of meeting technical needs and work for the community. Joe will, in a short moment, Joe will cover this in this part, but small cells are not subject to the same regulation as a traditional macro cell site. However, per Federal Communications Commission, FCC, wireless providers are still required to obtain any permits, lease agreements in each locality. So Verizon works hand in hand with each local jurisdiction on small cell placement, including right-of-way regulations and more. Not to mention, we comply fully with all the requirements for community notification, review, zoning, and permitting. Potential antenna locations must meet all local, state, and federal regulations. That's another important thing that people need to keep in mind. Verizon holds Federal Communications Commission licenses for the frequencies utilized, and we strictly follow their regulations. We often place small cells on existing infrastructure in the typical right-of-way. That includes light poles, utility poles, transit poles, signal light poles, and the like. The examples I'm going to show you soon are primarily utility poles. In other states, there are some examples, and Liz will show you some different types of poles that were used in different, again, every community is different and every area is different. As a result, the planning for that area, specific area, will be different. All right. Here, let's take a look at some of the examples here. Earlier, remember I talked about the difference, to being able to spot the difference between a 4G and 5G. So these are relatively old, dated at this point. You're looking at one in Rochester, New York, 4G antennas. This is a Cantenna. You notice there's a equipment cabinet located in all of these poles, on these utility poles, and here are the 4G antennas. So that's one way to spot a 4G, because every time you see a utility cabinet, equipment cabinet here, that indicates that's a 4G site. Now let's take a look at the 5Gs. We have Syracuse, which we'll talk about, that was just recently launched. We have Greece, Niagara Falls. As you can see, we have the small cells, and there's no equipment cabinet here in any of these sites. That indicates these are 5G antennas, and everything is already built into this antenna. So there's no separate equipment. So that's the easiest way to spot the difference between a 5G and 4G antenna. All right, getting close to the end for my portion here. While we are on this subject, I'd like to make a quick public service announcement, if I can, on 5G ecosystems and IoT, because we cover and talk about this. The University of Buffalo will be hosting its second annual 5G and wireless IoT conference on November 20th. That is not this Friday, an upcoming Friday. It's a virtual, free of charge conference with lots of great speakers from various industries, academia, and local and federal government agencies. That includes FCC's chairman, by the way. He'll be the keynote speaker. If you're interested in learning more about the 5G ecosystem, its benefits, such as particularly smart cities, don't miss it, because we have great speakers. And I provided the website information at the end of the presentation for you to check it out. The wireless 4G is already a critical component in today's communities. We already established that with some examples. Small cells 5G will enhance the speeds, latency, and efficiency of devices. And in the near future, you'll see present uses and future uses that will benefit you, your community, and others directly. There's a documentary that I think you should definitely check out if you get an opportunity. It's titled The Speed of Thought. It premiered back in September, so it hasn't been that long. The film gives viewers an inside look at how visionaries are using advanced connectivity to tackle some of the society's biggest challenges. Remember the 5G lab that I talked about? So it basically gives you a glimpse of what they do. In addition to watching the 5G in action, Speed of Thought will provide you a brief history of wireless connectivity, as well as the importance of low latency and the role it plays in the success of next generation technologies. So it's a good documentary. I'd definitely recommend it. It's about an hour long. All right. Here are some examples of emerging solutions that you are probably already familiar with or heard about. Smart city applications, which I'm sure as planners you're already familiar with. Lighting that dims and brightens when it detects movement to minimize power usage. In fact, I know for a fact a lot of municipalities are in the process or either in the process of converting or have already converted it, their lights to LED lights. Smart traffic will allow data-driven monitoring to traffic flows and pedestrian traffic, improve flow and minimize accidents. We would love that, right? Who wouldn't like have less accidents? Waste management is another area that can detect when a trash or a recycling container is full, alerting the services to pick it up, and mapping the routes to tell them to avoid wasted trips and unnecessary pollution. Fixed streaming services to the home or office like Apple or Google TV, which we already use. Autonomous vehicles, that's becoming pretty popular. There's more and more research going on. I know my school, University of Michigan, has a lot of work that they're doing. In fact, we're cooperating with them. as Verizon, the Internet of Things ranging from smart appliances to smart thermostats that can communicate in real time. So it's so many devices, so many different uses. That's why it's actually coined the terminology, the fourth industrial revolution. So there are many different areas, not to mention that it provides, it brings new revenue streams, all of these things that I talked about. But the biggest benefit of small cells, people don't really know much about, and it's not really discussed, is the 5G equipment is extremely energy efficient. It's actually up to 90% less than 4G when compared to per bit. So for that reason alone, it promises to dramatically reduce the energy consumption in telecom networks and across a range of industries, shrinking the carbon footprint and contribution to the fight against climate change. So for customers using the 5G network, complex functions could happen closer to the end user. That's what we call the edge computing. You probably hear that as well. Your phones will be, the computing will be closer to the end user, unlike what we're doing right now. That's because the latency will be drastically reduced with the 5G system. That means you, the end user, your device will not need as much processing capability and will consume less energy. And this could also increase the battery life, change the things that the connected devices are operating, reduce the maintenance costs, and so on and so forth. I'm going to conclude here and allow Joe to begin his presentation, but I'd like to share a short quote that I like, and it comes directly from our CEO, Hans. He says, in an era that is all about fast, clear, and secure connections between people and devices, and between devices, the connective network is the universal enabler, the essential platform. That is really true with 5G. And I hope I was able to capture some of that with all the information that I provided, but I won't take any time. I'll let Joe continue with his part. Joe?
Thank you, Yanel. And good morning, everyone. You flip to the next slide, Yanel, please. Thank you. So my name is Joseph Post. I'm an attorney in the Verizon legal department. My practice at Verizon is focused on issues in telecommunications regulation, originally on the landline side, but lately I've been doing a lot of work on issues relating to placing communications facilities, including both wireless and wireline facilities, on public and private property. I might say that in recent years, this has become a vital issue for both landline and wireless service providers. The purpose of my presentation today is to provide an overview of the legal framework that governs the placement of 5G facilities in public rights-of-way. These issues have become more important with the advent of 5G technology, which, as Yanel explained, depends to a much greater extent than any previous generation of technology on deploying large numbers of closely spaced cell sites or antennas. And of course, if you're going to deploy an antenna, you need someplace to put it, whether it's private or public property. Next slide, please. One point that often fails to get due emphasis in this area is that there's no such thing as a strictly wireless network. Cellular networks depend on the availability of landline facilities, and particularly ample capacity on fiber optic cables in order to transport signals between a provider's radio transmission and reception equipment on the one hand, and its mobile switching equipment on the other. So considering then fiber optics as an important component of wireless networks, I'm going to be discussing laws that apply to wireline as well as wireless facilities. Another point that I want to make up front concerning the scope of this presentation is that although most of the discussion in this area has focused on federal law, and in particular on the FCC's 2018 small cell order, state and local orders and regulations also have an extremely important role to play in this area. Next slide, please. All right, here's some caveats. You can read these on your own at your leisure. Next slide, please. 5G providers and local governments need each other. On the one hand, timely access to public property on reasonable terms and conditions is critical to 5G deployments. So providers need the cooperation of local governments. On the other hand, successful 5G deployments are critical to municipalities for all the reasons you heard from Yenal, and you'll hear more from this later today. So the failure to provide such access can leave municipalities behind in the race for 5G deployment. That will have unfortunate consequences for local access to advanced communications technologies, and those technologies play an important role in spurring employment and investment. So key message here today is that working together to develop reasonable terms and conditions for access to public rights of way is a win-win proposition for providers and local governments. And next slide, please. This slide shows three developments, recent developments in New York law that I would argue represent the way not to do things, not to accomplish the objectives I was talking about before. The first is an ordinance recently adopted by the City of Rochester. The ordinance implemented an extensive and expensive regime of user fees for the placement of facilities, both wireline and wireless, above or below Rochester streets. The ordinance is now being challenged in federal court in New York, and the decision will likely help clarify the limits on the fees that municipalities may charge under federal law. The second item shown here is state legislation that was recently adopted in New York, and it creates a system of fees administered by the State Department of Transportation for the placement of fiber optic facilities along state highways. Since state highways are seen as a prime location for placement of utility cables, the regulation has had and will continue to have an enormous financial impact on utilities looking to upgrade their network and offer advanced new technologies. The legislation, by the way, also prohibits providers from passing these right-of-way fees onto their customers. Finally, at the bottom, we have the state's rejection in 2 separate years of legislation that was originally included in the executive budgets for those 2 years that would have set statewide parameters for small cell deployment. All of these, I would argue, are examples of what state and local government should not be doing to encourage technological advancement, employment, and investment. Next slide, please. The key statute relating to utility access to right-of-ways in New York is the peculiarly named Transportation Corporations Law. It's peculiarly named because the statute has almost nothing to do with transportation, other than to the extent that there are a few sections that deal with ferry lines. The section I have quoted on this slide is section 27 of the TCL. In essence, that section gives telephone corporations the right to build their facilities upon, over, or under public roads, streets, and highways. And in essence, it gives them free access to the public rights of way. Utility facilities or telephone facilities can also be built on private property, subject to the right of the property owner to just compensation for the use of his or her property. One limitation on the rights granted by section 27 is that prior consent of the local government is required to install underground facilities, and we'll talk a little more about that later. I might mention that the state law that I mentioned earlier that established a system of user fees for placing cable along the state highway system was an amendment to the TCL that chipped away at these rights granted by Section 27. It really was the first such reduction in those rights in decades. And it made a significant change in well-established law of New York. Next slide, please. The rights that I just discussed are granted to telephone corporations. I've put the TCL's definition of telephone corporation on this slide. It's not terribly helpful in answering one of the key threshold issues, which is whether wireless companies are telephone corporations under the TCL. The core telephone corporations under the TCL, one might say, are regulated wireline telephone corporations. But the TCL isn't limited to such corporations, but the exact extent of its reach is not at all clear. So far as I'm aware, there are no court decisions addressing the issue of whether wireless communications providers count as telephone corporations under the TCL. Next slide, please. About 10 years ago, there's some very interesting litigation under the TCL between Verizon and the City of New York. The issue was whether the city could require Verizon to obtain a new city franchise in order to place and maintain communication cables under the city's streets. Verizon or its predecessors have had historical rights going back to the 19th century to place cables under New York City. The city took the position that it could require Verizon to obtain a franchise. And of course, under that franchise, Verizon would be required to pay substantial franchise fees to the city. The court ruled against the city in that case. More specifically, it concluded that Section 27, the section you just saw, gave telephone corporations a state-granted franchise to place aerial facilities over public streets. The situation for underground facilities was a little more complex because, as I mentioned before, Section 27 requires prior municipal consent to place underground facilities. But the court, and this is a really fascinating aspect of its decision for anyone who wants to look it up, took a deep dive into documents relating to the history of Verizon and the history of New York City, and concluded that the requisite consent had been granted back in the 19th century, and concluded as a matter of law that once the consent was once granted, it was basically permanent, it created a permanently vested right. I might mention that at the time the consents were granted, New York City only consisted of Manhattan and a portion of the Bronx. So the issue had to be investigated not only in New York City as it existed at that time, but also in separate municipalities such as the Village of Brooklyn that joined up and became part of New York City in, I believe it was 1898. Next slide, please. Ever since the days of Robert Moses, public authorities have been a key feature of the governmental landscape in New York, so we're going to have to take a brief look at them. Public authorities are quasi-governmental bodies that are created for particular purposes by the legislature. They're vested with certain sovereign powers. Most frequently, they're governed by boards, the majority of whose members are appointed by the governor. Many of them control significant rights of way suitable for the placement of utility facilities. For example, the New York State Thruway Authority, which manages the Thruway, which, as I mentioned before, is a state highway that's a prime location for the placement of utility cable. Another example is the Long Island Power Authority, which is a provider of electrical power in large portions of Long Island, and as a result owns solely or jointly thousands and thousands of poles in Long Island suitable for the attachment of 5G antennas. Now, there are a number of interesting issues relating to the granting of access to right-of-way by public authorities. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into them in any depth here. I will mention that the governing statute, the State Public Authorities Law, does not permit authorities to dispose of their property at less than fair market value. And that's generally been interpreted to apply to grants of rights to use state property for the placement of utility facilities. How that standard should be applied and to what extent it may be preempted by federal law that we're going to discuss later are interesting questions that undoubtedly will receive greater attention in the future. Next slide, please. All right, pole attachments. Poles are great for attachment to 5G. There are so many of them around, and they're high off the ground, which is an advantage when you want to place a radio transmitter or receiver that'll have significant range. There's quite a bit of law that's accumulated over the last couple of decades on attachment of things to poles. Utility poles, competing providers attached to utility poles. Of course, electric companies attach to telephone company poles and vice versa. In many cases, the poles are jointly owned. And recently, providers have become interested in putting radio antennas, cellular antennas on poles. Now, the basic regulatory framework for poles is set forth in the Federal Telecommunications Act, which gives regulatory authority to the FCC. But there's an interesting regime in place under which states can elect to displace FCC regulation in this area and take the regulatory burden on themselves. New York is one of those states that's chosen to, in the terminology, reverse preempt FCC regulation of pole attachments. So in New York, it's the State Public Service Commission that sets the terms and conditions of pole attachments. In 2019, the PSC issued a landmark order decreeing that wireless providers are entitled to non-discriminatory access to poles at cost-based rates, essentially the same rates adjusted for the amount of space they use as wireline providers pay for attaching their cables. This had the effect of reducing the rates charged in some cases for wireless attachments from hundreds or thousands of dollars a year per attachment to something more in the $10 to $20 range. There's still a lot of issues relating to the operational non-price aspects of pole attachments that are currently under review at the Commission. And we might hope to get an order on those issues sometime early in 2021. Want to mention that the PSC regulations related to pole attachment rates generally apply to municipally owned utilities, municipal electric companies, for example. And Long Island Power Authority, which I mentioned, it's a public authority, and it is substantially, not totally, but substantially exempt from PSC regulation, has nevertheless voluntarily adopted wireless pole attachment rates that comply with the Commission's requirements. So these are all very important developments in the law of pole attachments. All right, so we move on now to federal law, and the key federal law is Section 253, the Federal Telecommunications Act. The text is on the slide, but basically the section prohibits state or local right-of-way regulations that may, quote, prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting, close quote, the provision of telecommunications services. At the same time, the statute preserves the rights of state and local governments to collect fair and reasonable compensation on a competitively neutral basis. The local requirements must also be publicly disclosed. Next slide, please. I want to move on to the FCC's recent order clarifying Section 253. I just want to briefly mention that in this area, the FCC has stood on the shoulders of giants. There are a number of prior cases coming out of both the state and federal courts that began moving in the direction that began charting the course that the FCC set in its small cell order. I'm not going to have time to discuss these prior cases, but a couple of the key ones are cited on this slide. Next slide, please. In September 2018, the FCC issued its critical, the document was called the Declaratory Ruling and Third Report and Order on the application of Section 253 to the placement of small cell facilities in public rights of way. Two of the key holdings in the order are quoted on this slide. First, a requirement will have the effect of prohibiting wireless telecommunications services. And recall, that's the standard under Section 253, if it, quote, materially inhibits the provision of such services. Why is that important? In large part because it rejected prior court rulings that held that Section 253 can only come into play if a state or local requirement created a total inability to offer a service. Obviously, material inhibition and total inability are very different standards. Now, I might point out that when the order was issued, there was some head scratching over whether it applied to wireline as well as wireless facilities. I mean, it was written in the specific context of small cell placement. However, just Monday, late breaking development here, the FCC issued a new declaratory ruling that applied that interpretation of Section 253 in the context of wireline facilities, specifically fiber optic cables. I'm going to touch on that decision a little more later on. Next slide, please. All right, so with respect to fees, the FCC said that state or local governments could only require communications providers to pay a reasonable approximation of the objectively reasonable costs of a deployment, and that the regulations must be non-discriminatory. The order fleshes this out a bit in a three-part test. The one is that the fees must be a reasonable approximation of costs specifically related to and caused by the deployment. The caused by language, I think, is extremely important. It means we're talking about incremental costs that wouldn't be incurred but for the deployment. That basically means that municipalities can't recover their sunk costs from small cell providers. The second part of the test is that only objectively reasonable costs may be included. Speculative costs aren't allowed. And the fees can't be higher than those charged to similarly situated competitors in like situations. The FCC has set safe harbor rates. Those are shown on the slide. These are presumptively reasonable fee levels. If a municipality wants to exceed the safe harbor levels, it bears the burden of proving that the fees it set are cost-based. One interesting issue that arises under the cost standard is the question of double dipping. That is, imposing fees twice for the same facilities. For example, in many cities, when you want to attach an antenna to a pole that's already in the public right-of-way, where the pole owner is already paying the municipality for being in the right-of-way, sometimes the municipality will charge a separate right-of-way fee for the provider placing the antenna, even though arguably that antenna doesn't increase the burden that the pole imposes on the right-of-way. That particular issue, so far as I know, hasn't been litigated, although it's ripe for some form of legal challenge. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a hot off the presses ruling that came out on Monday. And it touches on the double dipping issue, because what the municipality was doing in that case was collecting fees both from the company that deployed fiber optic facilities, the crown castle of that state, if you will, and also by the company that used that cable to provide communication services. And the FCC clearly ruled that that was impermissible, and I think it's an extremely important precedent. Next slide, please. The order also extends to non-monetary requirements. Non-monetary requirements would include aesthetic-based requirements, spacing of antennas, minimum permitted spacing. But one extremely obvious example is undergrounding. For obvious reasons, your 5G antenna that's placed underground is not going to be terribly effective. Next slide, please. The FCC also imposed time limits in the form of a so-called shot clock on the processing of applications for the placement of facilities in the right-of-way. Generally, there's a 60-day limit for co-located facilities on existing structures and a 90-day limit for new poles. Next slide, please. There's a great deal of activity in the courts that grew out of the small cell order. The main court proceeding is the proceeding initiated by parties who challenge the legality of the small cell order. A number of these challenges were brought in various courts around the country. And as is typical in those cases, the federal judicial system conducted a drawing and assigned the case randomly. The case wound up in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which the Ninth Circuit is essentially the West Coast. Opponents of the small cell order thought that that was a very lucky assignment, that the case was being assigned to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit had previously upheld much more lax restrictions on municipal regulations. Also, it has something of a reputation as a generally liberal court that was likely to support the interests of municipalities over the interests of communications companies. As it turned out, however, the court upheld the order almost in its entirety. The only thing that was overturned were some restrictions that the FCC had imposed on aesthetics-based limitations on the use of the right-of-way. So petitions for rehearing were denied by the court. The next step for the opponents of the small cell order, if they care to take it, is to go to the Supreme Court by filing what's known as a petition for certiorari. Normally, there's a 90-day limit for that, but it's because of COVID-related extensions. I believe that Supreme Court challenges to the Ninth Circuit ruling can be filed up until March of 2021. There are also two proceedings pending that were brought by Verizon. One is the Rochester case that I mentioned. The other challenges right-of-way fees that were set by Clark County, Nevada. That proceeding is pending at the FCC. Next slide, please. So I started off this presentation by saying that federal law in this area is supplemented by state and local law, which has its own important role to play. I also observe that providers and state and local governments share an interest in establishing reasonable terms and procedures governing the use of public rights of way by 5G networks. So consistent with those observations, I strongly believe that providers and local governments should work together to encourage the enactment of reasonable state laws and local ordinances to govern these issues. Why do you need such laws? Well, because they create a definite fixed framework, resolve open issues, and thus greatly reduce the transaction costs for both sides that are associated with negotiating terms and conditions over and over again. So with those observations, I'll end there and hand the talking stick off to my colleague, Liz Glidden.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. I wanted to, introduce myself again. I'm Liz Glidden. I have been a planner, municipal planner for 25 years, and recently went over to the private sector to change things up a little bit. And I'm now with Verizon in their regulatory and real estate department. I have two goals for everyone today. I really want to talk about the impact of 5G, particularly in a COVID and post-pandemic world. This presentation, if I had given this in January of 2020, it might be a little bit different. We have learned quite a few things, and I wanted to just highlight some of those today. And I also want to provide the planners watching, with the skill base and the resources so that you can decide what the best path to permitting for these small cells are in your community, and provide you with some citations in other cities that have done this before, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So you can have some research tools to check in on some other municipalities that have done this. Full disclosure, I live in Connecticut. I work mostly with Connecticut municipalities, although I do also have sites in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So I'm not going to have a lot of citations for New York per se, but I think that you'll get a lot of value out of some of the websites and things that I share with you. So I thought I'd start with some general takeaways from COVID-19. COVID is going to change the way we look at a number of things. One of them is transportation. I think after this, there is going to be a need for transportation independence. Are people going to want to take mass transport? Where are they going to be taking it to? Are people still going to be commuting into our cities the way that they have in the past? I'm thinking particularly of New York City, but the same could be true for any large city. Next slide. Food security. This doesn't have a lot to do with technology per se, but it's certainly one of the takeaways from COVID-19. I live in a rural part of the state. I think for those of you, particularly in upstate, probably have had an uptick in local farms, CSAs, and there was, I think, a concern early on in the pandemic about food scarcity. How are we going to get fresh food transported to our areas? And I think that there are some things that can be useful with the application of this technology that would help that. Next slide, please. Urban flight. I think for those in urban areas, if they had the ability and the means to leave, they did. I know in Connecticut, we've certainly seen an uptick in our real estate markets. I'm sure upstate New York has seen the same. Rent vacancies are up by 6%, I think, in New York City, and the rents are down by 3%. So there is this kind of parallel movement, I think, of the white flight in the 1970s, but I think we're beginning to see this again. And I don't know what will happen in the next few years, if that's a trend that will continue, or if it will go the other way. Next slide, please. Office space. A big interest in being in the cities, of course, is being close to resources, restaurants and work, places of work. What's going to happen with the office spaces that are currently vacant? Most of us, and as Deanna remarked with Verizon, we have been working remotely. So is there going to be a need for the same type of office space, the same amount of office space? And if not, what is going to happen to that space? And I would anticipate that there's going to be a need for some kind of flex space. so that as trends change, these spaces can adapt. But that remains to be seen. Next slide. Outdoor spaces. I mean, this is something that planners have been advocating for a number of years. The plazas, the open air markets, sort of these boulevards of sorts that are public spaces. And now we see a need for those spaces to be publicly connected. Libraries and schools have been closed. So where are people getting that Wi-Fi signal if they do not have it in their home? And next slide, please. I thought this was an interesting slide, something a lot of us can relate to. This is two girls doing their homework outside of a Taco Bell. For a lot of people in underprivileged communities, their first gateway to the internet is on a mobile device, AKA a cell phone. But there is not a lot of opportunity. I should say there isn't always internet available. So the Wi-Fi connections are not always available. Even the Chromebooks and the hotspots that have been distributed by a number of school districts rely on a network that is essentially and ultimately hardwired, right? Just as Joe was talking about the fiber optics and the need for those, the need for a wireline. And so how can we have access for everyone? Digital equity, not necessarily equality, but equity, where, we really serve everyone in the community. Next slide, please. Data, another takeaway is just the need for that granular data that we've seen in COVID. This is true with COVID testing. We also have a contact tracing. I anticipate that type of tracing is going to continue. And there's a need to use and break down data fields into even more narrow data sets so that we can get immediate results. And that is something that that technology and 5G and the low latency of this new technology can really assist with. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to end with digital equality, because whether or not you're talking about health or data or education, these are areas where there's been historically been a divide within our communities, and that's a divide that we want to end. So, how can we have this infrastructure in place to assist all of those involved, from everything from education to equal access for healthcare, for workforce development, and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the first steps that you can do with your community, your municipality, to consider how to embrace and attract this type of infrastructure within your community. The first step is going to be to gather stakeholders, and that's going to be, city representatives, as well as, community members, downtown partnerships, if you have one, chambers of commerce. You may want to include your own, someone from your IT department, but typically, the three big ones are a city manager or chief of staff, the planning department, and the public works department. And you will want to initiate the conversation about, what are some of the things that you want to take into consideration as you develop some kind of path for permitting. And as you begin this, you may want to consider, who has the bandwidth, which department is going to be able to review and address these applications. If you are in a small community and you are the town planner, you you may not have the ability within your own department to consider reviewing these. Next slide. So usually the lead organization the organization that takes the lead with regard to path of permitting will have an effect on the type of legislation that that takes effect to allow the small cells. So for example, if the city manager or chief of staff takes the lead, it may, the legislation or the path to permitting may come in by way of an ordinance. Some planning departments have done a zoning policy. A lot of times there are conditions or standards that if those are met, then they can essentially be done with a grant of location type of permit. Because we're talking about the rights of way, which is typically housed in the Public Works Department. Sometimes there are many communities that have done simply an electrical permit and an encroachment permit through the Public Works Department. And they've been essentially the lead agency, and that's where the applications are reviewed. There are a number of communities that have also done license agreements. And this is usually in tandem with an ordinance, but not always. And essentially what it is it sets the terms. How many years would the license agreement be good for? What are the annual reviews? Who holds the insurance? Are there any terms? And it hammers out, it's generally an umbrella agreement that hammers out all the specifics with regard to length of time and who the rent gets paid to and all of those things. Next slide, please. So what is the right permitting path for your community? I stumbled across this. This is from the Western Connecticut Council of Governments. You can see the website at the bottom of the page. They, we don't, in Connecticut, we aren't really run by counties, but we have regional planning areas. And so this is one of those 9 regional planning areas in the state. And they did a study on looking at the different types of ways to allow small cell infrastructure. And they really did a kind of a crash course for planners, identifying the terms and things of that nature. And it's a really good resource document to take a look at. Next slide. So in that, you can see that they created a matrix, and they essentially looked at some of the pros and cons of having a zoning ordinance versus a municipal ordinance, licensing, etc. And so it might help for you to make determinations with regard to your community on what are some of the top priorities. If you have, if you're in a hilly area and you have view shed issues, you know, there might be one type of path to permitting that will give you more security than another. And again, I just wanted to highlight that. Next slide, please. So one of the areas where we have had a good deal of success is in the city of Boston. So Boston created an appendix. Obviously, Boston is a big city and they have a number of different light types of fixtures. So they created a standard using all of the various types of light poles that they have. Everything from goose heads to acorns to cobra heads. And they came up with essentially a matrix for what, you know, on specific light standards, what the carriers would be allowed to attach to and how. So does it need to be painted a certain color? What are the height restrictions? And I guess I would add that within the FCC order, there are definitions of what small wireless facilities are, or small cell. And within the FCC, it can't be taller than 50 feet high. Generally speaking, I don't know that the carriers generally need that kind of height, but I know that in the deployments that I've been involved in, it's usually around 25 feet is the typical height. But you may want to say, no more than 5 feet above the existing structure, or set certain height limits that are appropriate for the scale and density of your community. Next slide, please. The other thing you're going to need to discuss with your stakeholders is whether or not you will allow small cell facilities on traffic light structures. So here is one on the left-hand side of your screen in Boston. Boston did allow us to attach 2 traffic structures. I thought it was, I think it blends in fairly well. And that was a choice that their community made. There are some public works departments that are not super comfortable with that for various reasons, and that's something you're going to have to work out with your own community. On the right-hand side, we have a pole attachment. This happens to be a very large light pole, just by nature, because it's an extremely big intersection near Boston University. But I just, I put this in there as a typical type of light attachment on a historic light structure. Next slide, please. Here's a few examples from Massachusetts on the way that other communities have done it. License agreements, Chelsea, Massachusetts, and Springfield, Massachusetts have good examples of those. Marlborough, Mass did zoning regulations, and they do require a hearing for pole attachments, or I should say, small cell attachments on light poles. This is not for utility poles. These are just for municipally owned light poles that are within the public right of way. And then Arlington, Mass, Salem, Quincy, Melrose, and Portland, Maine all did some type of permitting that was based out of a city ordinance. And you can Google any of those and you'll be able to find their regulations very easily. Next slide, please. Just a few do's and don'ts that I thought would be helpful. Set up a subcommittee of stakeholders. You will probably want to create an inventory of your light standards. You may just have 1 or 2 light standards. You may have several, but you're going to want to look at those. In some locations that a standalone smart pole might be better than using a decorative pole. Sometimes calling it what it is in a historic district is a better option than trying to incorporate a design that doesn't fit in with regard to scale or aesthetics. Try to think beyond the fiscal revenue of these pole attachments. Their 5G is going to bring a ton of opportunity. It is a platform for innovation and for economic development. And think of what that is going to bring to your community, particularly if you are a community that has a hospital or university. It's going to really help develop some critical innovation elements to your town, to your community. You may want to prepare a fact sheet. One of the things that the FCC order addresses is that they address essentially that health standards or health effects are not something that can be taken on at the local level, and that they have already made that establishment. And you may find it worthwhile to go to the World Institute of Health, to go to NIH, Google a few things from the New York Times or whatever you find to be reputable, non-biased organizations, and just put together a fact sheet. You're going to find that people in the community are going to have a number of questions. The health effects element almost always comes up. And having been in the public sector for a long time, I realized that you can't just say, well, the FCC said we can't talk about this, because that never goes over very well in a public forum. So be prepared for that. You may want to consider they're already in your community. In most communities, we have 4G small cells, and a lot of the public doesn't realize that, and they're concerned about what these things are going to look like, not even realizing that they're already there. The technology is going to change quickly. So Yano made mention of the fact that they're already, the antennas that we use today are slimmer and smaller than the ones we used a year ago. So you want to construct whatever your ordinance regulations are. You want them finite enough to put the type of standards that you would like, but loose enough that it can be accommodated in the future for newer technology that may be similar sized, might be smaller, might be slightly different, because you're not going to want to update your regulations, particularly the small cell section, on a regular basis. You're going to want to consider, your staff resources. Again, if you are in a small community and you are the planning staff of one, you may not want a terribly arduous permitting process, because the review process would be, it would be very time consuming. And lastly, I just wanted to say, view the carriers as a partner. I think in planning, and particularly in the public sector, it's very easy to feel that a private corporation is sort of the fox in the hen house. I think that the carriers really have a lot of knowledge. They've, Verizon is deployed in over 50 cities, and I'm sure the other carriers are in a very similar boat. We've done this with other communities, and I would allow our past history and some of our wins and successes, as well as some of our mistakes, help. The carriers want to bring in this technology. And it's going to assist in a huge investment in your community. Next slide. Just a few don'ts. I would not restrict small cells by zoning district. Again, as planners, I think we like to think sort of in a Euclidean mindset. I wouldn't allow them in commercial districts, but then prohibit them in residential districts. This is a network that functions like a blanket, and it's going to work with cell towers and rooftop applications that we have in your community, and the nodes or small cells themselves all need to work together as an integral part of a network. So they're going to need to be where people are, and that is going to include residential neighborhoods. So again, that I would go back to whether or not you want them on traffic structures or what your light structures are, and give consideration to it, organizing it that way rather than by zoning district. You don't get into the health effects per se. I would refer to a fact sheet if you go down that route. I wouldn't require co-location yet. So again, a big difference with this technology and the cell towers. In cell towers, you build one cell tower and typically all three carriers end up locating on that. The small cells are at such a different density and such a different height that it doesn't work for that. So the likelihood of two carriers being able to go on the same light pole or the same traffic structure is very unlikely because of the separating distances. So understand that, it's going to be one carrier per pole, essentially. And I would say, this should be a priority to your community, and I would not outsource this to a third party. I think that it's very easy, as planners are asked more and more to do, to say, oh, well, let's get a consultant in here to look at this, or let's look at another party or another company to assist with this. And I would just caution you that every carrier is going to have their own way of deploying a network, and that a third party may have some great ideas, and it may take some of the burden off you as the planners, but that it will, that nobody knows their network like the carrier themselves. And I would try to just come up with fair, equal type of regulations that apply to everybody at the same time. I would not encourage you to have a third party builder, for example, come and build smart poles in your community or anything like that, because you don't know that that's where the carriers are going to want to go, or that that's they may have a rooftop site nearby, and that area is not needed. So that could just lead to quite a bit of extra infrastructure that you don't need. Next slide, please. I had talked a little bit about the standalone poles. I should have had this slide a little bit up, but this is an example of a standalone pole. Again, I think that a pole attachment on an existing light pole is a good option, but sometimes, something that is freestanding doing its own thing is a very, is more amenable to the community. Next slide, please. So what's next? We don't know all the potential 5G applications. I just wanted to leave you with a few ideas. I think that 5G, we know that it's going to have a tremendous impact on emergency services. There is already applications out that assist firefighters to find, using special infrared cameras to find human life in the event of a fire, where they can go in, find human beings through the smoke, and where there's very low visibility standards, and essentially rescue them. We all know that there's going to be smart city applications like the parking app. Some of your communities may already have that, where there is an application that allows you to find vacant parking areas. I was thinking about possibilities. Connecticut was devastated by the emerald ash borer, and we don't know what all the applications are going to be, but I bet you that there is going to be something that comes out of this that is going to help us with our forestry and to be better stewards of that. I think the possibility for 5G, because of the low latency and the real-time effects, are really going to have an impact on people with specific handicaps, people who are deaf, and people who can't see. That may give them greater independence in being able to navigate the world. And, with farming, one of the things is using artificial intelligence. They have come up with ways to identify the difference between plants and weeds. And there are some farming applications, particularly out west, where they've been able to reduce the amount of pesticides they use by almost 75%. So there are great things coming. We don't know what all of them are, but I think it's going to be a really exciting time, and I would encourage all of you to, incorporate this type of infrastructure into your community. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Yeno.
Thank you. Jesse, do we still have time? I'd like to have in 2 minutes or less. I know we're running out of time here.
We've got about 5 minutes. You want to wrap that up and then take questions?
Sure. So the last portion is about Syracuse. The presentation is about Syracuse. I want to highlight something very quickly here. Economic studies, we talked about economic importance of how much contribution will this have on any given states or localities economy. You can find a lot of research out there based on a national basis or a state basis. In fact, what you're looking at here is from CTIA. That's an industry organization based in Washington, D.C. They have specifics related to New York State. But what I found, and this is a little bit dated at this point, but there's one that's actually specific to upstate New York from PPI, Progressive Policy Institute, again, based in Washington, D.C. It specifically deals with upstate New York, Buffalo region, Syracuse, and gets into all of these details and how they could benefit and what types of benefits would it provide to these communities. So feel free to take a look at it. I think it's a valuable and helpful research. Based on my observations, both from upstate and other states, I think the majority of the local and state level elected officials recognize the critical and economic importance of connectivity. They really do get it, even though sometimes you run into issues, but it's about for other things. They certainly get the idea that this is an important important development that has a lot of economic impact. Governor Cuomo made that very clear in his most recent State of the Art address. In fact, I would argue that this recognition or vision, if you will, for connectivity and inclusive growth is precisely what made Syracuse an ideal city for 5G. If you are not already aware, approximately about a month ago, we launched 5G ultra wideband. That's the fastest 5G in Syracuse. It's the first city in upstate New York. So we're really proud of that fact. My colleague Greg and others who played a great role in making that happen. Kudos to all of them, all of our team for upstate. Deployment is still not 100% completed. You can go take a look at some of the maps here. You'll see this is active on Verizon's website, by the way, you can find. It's still not 100% completed, but when it does, we expect to serve the significant portions of the city. So it's kind of on a limited basis at this point. But as I indicated previously, building out the network is a time, labor, and capital intensive process, which requires the deployment of fiber in each cell site. So that's why it takes some time. I want to conclude with this. Let me briefly highlight our ongoing partnership with the City of Syracuse. A lot of the things that Liz just mentioned, do's and don'ts, Syracuse got all of the do's right. That's part of the reason why we want to talk about Syracuse, and they were the leader and pioneer. And we refer to them as a role model. And every time we meet other municipalities, we tell them, if you need additional help, take a look at Syracuse. We'd be happy to connect you with the staff there. By the time they engaged Verizon, Syracuse had already successfully determined the needs of their community's next generation technology services and applications as part of foundational investment under their Syracuse Surge project, which is something that the Mayor Ben Walsh had as a vision. And I think that's the core, that's the very important part of it. Secondly, from the mayor to the county executive, almost everyone supported the Syracuse Surge and its inclusive approach, which encouraged the business community. Soon everyone was unified. So that's another important core aspect, again, Liz talked about, unifying, bringing everybody together. Thirdly, they knew their assets, their conditions, the assets of their conditions and where they were located. Syracuse, for example, acquired all of their 17,000 streetlights and retrofitted nearly all of them to LED lights. They have conversion projects alone created potential new partnership opportunities. A lot of the communities are either in the process or are considering doing these kinds of things. At that point, 5G was basically another element of technology infrastructure that was determined to help support all of these other foundational investment initiatives. So basically that all they needed is to have 5G next. And that's exactly what happened here. And I would argue that the key factors in deployment to 5G you have to have 5 C's first. That's cooperation, communication, coordination, consolidation, and co-location. Most of the stuff that just Liz went over and explained in detail. As my mapping out the process could be a major challenge. It takes obviously time, and we've seen this in many communities, but this is not to say that there weren't any challenges in Syracuse. But again, because they followed this order and did everything right, both sides were able to address those in a timely and efficient way. Our operational timelines in this case were from the initial meeting to the launch of the antennas. The 5G sites were basically from 12 to 18 months. And that includes the pandemic-related delays. And Syracuse, again, kudos to them. They did a great job being able to accommodate everything, being able to transition to doing things digitally and addressing issues ahead of time. And they were the pioneer, and we think our partnership can be an ideal guide and role model for the rest of the municipalities in upstate, and that's why we wanted to mention them here as a role model. Thank you very much. Basically, this is all I have, and here are the links that we just mentioned. Our email address is here, myself, Joe, and Liz. All the other links that are mentioned in the presentation, you can find it here.
Great. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you again to our sponsor, WSP. At this time, we're going to take any questions. If anyone has any, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Yeah, I think I'll start us off. One of the questions that I have is about the trend to underground utilities, and does that pose a challenge for 5G applications, or if a 5G is small cell site is on an existing pole, would that prevent the municipality from moving to an underground utilities?
I can answer that because I've actually had a fair bit of experience with that. So, and one of the things I wanted to say too is that in terms of the utilities, the small cells going on the utilities, there is a tremendous regulatory process that goes on with that. And most of the carriers have agreements with the existing utilities. And within those agreements are things that if the pole needs to come down for some reason, that we would then take our equipment off. If it's because the utilities are being put underground, then it is on the carrier to find another location. And typically we would look for a light pole in the vicinity. Sometimes one of those smart poles that I made reference to would be a good fit. But it would certainly have it would not have any detrimental effect to a utility trying to bury their equipment underground.
Great, thank you. Not seeing any other questions in the chat. I'll give it a little bit more time in case anyone has, but again, I'd like to thank our speakers and our sponsor, WSP. I'd like to let everyone know that our next conference session will be held on Tuesday, the 17th, and is titled Planning for Diverse Community Food Systems, presented by the Buffalo University Planning Program. And we hope you enjoy the remaining conference sessions. Looks like we do have a question. Can each panelist discuss C-band?
I can't because I'm not quite sure what it is. So I'm going to defer to my colleagues.
Nor I am afraid.
That would be, I'm somewhat familiar with it for full disclosure, but that's overly technical. I'm not really capable of providing the information that the audience is looking for here, but I'll be happy to address that if they can send us an email and get back to them with additional information that they can read. I'm not an engineer, as I mentioned earlier, so I'm not an RF engineer. It's difficult for me to provide an accurate information at this point.
That's fair enough.
Jesse, I'd like to ask a quick question if I could.
Absolutely.
You know, in rural areas of even my region, I represent a 4-county area here in the Albany, New York area, and we still have areas where, you know, wireless service is shaky at best. So what advice would you give to a rural community? You know, clearly the market might not be there, but for a public safety perspective, and certainly in this COVID environment, we want to provide that access. Does that become, does it become the onus on the local government to approach you folks about it, or how does that work?
Liz, would you like to go first since you're more familiar with the rural areas in Connecticut? I'll provide an example from upstate.
Yeah, that is, it's tough because in many cases, the infrastructure is not there. I mean, the broadband elements are not there, and then, but the need is there. I know that there is legislation that is going to provide funding to communities for broadband in rural communities. And I think once that network is in place, or the fiber optics, the fiber is in place with that broadband, the carriers will follow. And I know the government is looking at ways to fund that because it's a problem all over the country. And then once that is essentially in place, then I think the carriers will be interested in establishing small cells from there that will help with coverage and capacity. You know, and to your point, even with everything that we saw in COVID, because the numbers went, everyone was using their devices more than ever. So it's not just the broadband and the internet that people are needing. A lot of times people need the internet just to be able to place a call because they have that Wi-Fi function. So I hear you. Yanel, do you have anything to add to that?
And yes, it's a challenge to, obviously, as I mentioned in the details for small cells, we're primarily going after, for small cells particularly, we're primarily going after places where there's dense numbers of people, and it makes it extremely challenging for any carrier to be able to deploy in rural areas. But you may have seen some developments. I didn't get into these details, but the 5G technology, there's different layers, if you will, low, mid, and the millimeter wave, the one that we deployed in Syracuse. There might be some alternatives. Engineers and carriers are offering different models. So that could be one alternative to be able to provide coverage and capacity in some rural areas, utilizing some of those capabilities of mid-band, especially mid-band 5G in some of those areas. But again, it remains to be a challenge, and I've been seeing some of the basically state funding available that's being made available to local municipalities. And I think there's a different track, there's a different division within our company that deals with that. But there's a lot of effort that we're seeing, especially since COVID, since the pandemic started. I think there's a lot more investment and consideration as to how to improve connectivity in rural areas.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question that we have here, asking how 5G rollout can relate to commercial development and subdivision regulations, and if there's a way to include that in the process.
Subdivision regulations in terms of, I'm assuming residential subdivisions.
Yeah, I think the question's looking more towards, new development. How can it account for 5G rollout, since that's going to be the future?
Yeah, so, there's a lot of new subdivisions that are inherently have the utilities buried. And so if there is lighting within that subdivision, that would be one opportunity. Also creating some kind of sleeve or conduit tunnel for fiber optics as they are able to come in, just like you would with a sewer sleeve, so to speak. I think there is, I would put that on the developer to make it more attractive. And it's not, when you're going through the construction phase, it's not a big financial ask. Again, I would require that any kind of lighting that is in that subdivision be allowed to be used for carriers for the purpose of small cells.
Great. We do have one more question that came in. As a planner at the local government level, help us understand how Verizon's working to address and mitigate concerns related to increased small cell technology in communities and possible health implications. They recently had an installer address visual concerns by applying 3M tape to the technology to make it less visible and reflecting the surrounding landscape.
I mean, I would say, you know, all of our equipment is well under the FCC standards. I mean, in fact, we typically, at least on the deployments that I've been involved with in Hartford and in Connecticut, it is a fraction of the permitted RF emissions is what, you know, that we're using. I would, again, work on a fact sheet or work on some kind of, you know, maybe doing your own resource. And we can provide resources. I think Yanel did in one of his last slides, but I think the public tends to be skeptical of things that we are publishing or things that we are pointing to. So I would look for some, you know, some peer-reviewed information. I know the University of Pennsylvania has a division that has been very involved. You may have a local CTIA. I would look at organizations that have just global credibility, like WHO or NIH, to see what is available. That's all I have. I don't know if Joe or Yanal have anything else to say with regards to the health effects.
I'd like to add this, especially during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, the misinformation was spreading. Misinformation related to the 5G was spreading a lot faster than COVID, I would argue, throughout, not just here in this country, but even in Europe. Here, especially in Syracuse, we had instances where our crews, while they were trying to install the equipment, were harassed by the local neighborhoods and communities. Sometimes police had to get involved. So it was a challenge and it needed to be addressed. I think there was a lot of, including FCC from the federal level and local governments level, there were press releases trying to inform. Again, this is all misinformation. And I'd like to give one example. Earlier, I mentioned that I have almost a 2-year-old son and I work and live in this community. So I've done my own research. I provided some of that information here in this site. If you can go to the Facts About RF Energy, there's a website for Syracuse. There are additional links that the audience can go and find out more about. There's New York State Wireless Association. They do a variety of events almost every month. Just recently, they brought another speaker, an expert, a professor from a university to talk about this. I've been engaging with the University of Buffalo electrical engineering faculty for this conference and for other reasons. And I asked these questions to them personally, whether because they've been working on this technology in the lab and outside, and they do a lot of research, obviously. And they basically told me that they don't have any worries, and they're actually they're on the record. You can search and find them. And again, local media in Buffalo talking about the importance of 5G technology. Again, yes, they have a right to be skeptical, but at the same time, there's plenty of information that's out there from authoritative resources that they can get the information from.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think we're about out of time. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for providing us with this information, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.